Greetings, welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinars. Today's session is about unlocking the code to digital literacy, implications for learning and assessment. The speaker today is Associate Professor Joe Coldwell-Neilson from Deakin University in Australia. So Joe, would you like to begin, please?
Thank you very much, Matthew, and welcome, and thank you for joining us to hear what I have to say. Unlocking the Code to Digital Literacy is part of my ALT fellowship program. I should move the slide across. Here we go. And I do have a website which you may be interested in having a look at some point. I do add information to that website occasionally. It's a little out of date at the moment because I have been on non-service leave. I am looking forward to getting that up to date in the next few weeks. So let me start by talking about what we're going to talk about. My first part of this talk is going to be around why we need to revisit digital literacy. We have been working in an environment where we make assumptions about digital literacy. We have our own understandings of digital literacy, but I want to challenge you to think a little bit more broadly about what digital literacy may encompass. And I'd like to introduce an understanding of digital literacy that I hope will work for the 21st century. And then use that understanding to talk a little bit about how we can transform assessment with respect to digital literacy. And this is work that I will be talking about is some work that I undertook with the School of Optometry here at Deakin University. Okay. Back at the end of last year, there was a piece in the conversation that was talking about the skill levels that our workers are going to require in the near future. And what they were talking about was the skills that will be required in a digitally disrupted environment. So the first point, the largest group of workers is in the highest skill level. They were talking about university graduates or graduates with at least a bachelor's degree, which from my perspective is good news for our future employment, but it's something that we need to be conscious of when we are teaching undergraduates and postgraduates. The writer indicated that communication and people skills were becoming increasingly important, and I think we all recognise that. But what was really interesting was they were talking about programming skills being less important than digital literacy. And this particular point is of concern, as the primary and secondary education systems are focusing on teaching programming rather than digital literacy in the context of the digital technologies curriculum, which was introduced in 2015. Technological advances equate to a need to discover new ways of using the technology, which requires strong communication skills, problem-solving skills, and digital literacy skills. So just the communication, problem-solving, and digital literacy keeps on popping up.
Sorry, Joe, I need to interrupt. We've had quite a few reports of quite poor sound quality. So could you possibly get closer to your microphone? I think the sound is potentially just coming through the speakers of your machine rather than your headset, if you happen to have one.
It's coming out through a Jabra unit, which is right in front of me. Is that any better?
Yeah, as close as you can get, because it seems like there's your voice it sounds like it's quite a far away from the microphone. So.
Okay, I'll try and get a bit closer. How's that?
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Okay, keep going. Let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
So, according to the Foundation for Young Australians, oops, sorry, leaning on my keyboard, big mistake. Come back. Okay, let me do a little bit of revision here of positioning and see if I can not lean on my keyboard again. My apologies. So according to the Young Foundation for Young Australians, it's estimated that over half of Australian workers will need to be able to use, configure or build digital systems in the next 2 to 3 years. A helpful framework for classifying the digital skills required in our workforce recently emerged as part of the UK Digital Skills Task Force. The UK Forum on Computing Education classified 4 bands of digital skills, which you can see here. And they estimated the proportion of the workforce expected to be in each category. Now, I was particularly attracted to this particular model because of the digital muggle. The digital muggle, they suggest that no digital skills are required. And quite frankly, I'm having grave difficulty in trying to work out which 7% of the workforce require no digital skills at all. So if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear them. Digital citizen, so in this case it's the ability to use technologies purposefully and confidently. And they estimate that 37% of the workforce would be in this category. The digital worker is the ability to evaluate, configure and use complex digital systems. 46% of the workforce, and bearing in mind from the conversation piece, the number of the percentage of the workforce that's going to require bachelor's skills would suggest that they are the digital workers, which basically means that a digital worker is not somebody who's coming from computer science or IT or information systems, but it's a more general category of digital worker. Digital maker are the technologists of the workforce. So these are the people who would be expected to build digital technology. So these are the computer scientists and information systems people. So digital worker really relates to all disciplines, and we need to be able to prepare our students to work effectively in a digital environment. Complex digital systems, any system that's really in the workplace that's not a productivity tool. So it goes beyond using Microsoft Office and so on, but rather more industry-related systems such as finance, human resources, specific customer relations management type systems and so on. So the definition that I think most people are familiar with as far as digital literacy is concerned comes from Glister, and this was published in 1997. It's the ability to understand and use information in multiple formats from a wide range of sources. And this is the definition that pops up in some form in most universities. So certainly Deakin University's graduate learning outcome related to digital literacy looks a little bit like this. The problem with this one is that it was articulated in 1997. So that's now 20 years old, over 20 years old. And that's a very long time in technology terms. And so what we want to do is explore the relevance of this definition in 2018. And to do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of computer history. So if you are a computer scientist and you know all this stuff, my apologies, but it may ring a few memories for you. In the 1990s, when Gilster articulated his definition of digital literacy, a computer like this looked like this. This is an IBM mainframe. Only experts had access to the computer, people like programmers and operators and so on. Users accessed the data via an interface that was designed to hide the technology. Desktop machines look like this. I wonder how many of you can remember having one of these at home. I certainly had a Mac, and I had one or two of the other ones as well. So Those interested in IT ventured into this space, basically still experts. Machines were generally standalone, and sharing of data and applications was done by exchanging floppy disks. Sounds wonderful. How many of you remember these? Mobile devices in 1997 looked like this. You could phone or text, unless you had a BlackBerry, which was an early personal digital assistant. What's really interesting is the impact that these changes in technology have had on internet traffic. And this is a little graph that I have found a little while ago, which is, is absolutely mind-blowing. So this is a graph showing internet traffic globally, and it comes from Cisco. In the 1990s, which is sort of down in this sort of lime green area, the traffic was approximately 1 gigabyte per day. Remember, this is global traffic. So if you have an external backup drive, it's probably a terabyte, or at least a terabyte. The world's internet traffic, you could store 1,000 days on your external hard drive. Traffic increased to 1 gigabyte per hour from about 1997. So this is in the red zone. That's a little bit better, but it's still 24 gigabytes a day. And this is, remember, global internet traffic. And this is actually post-Glister's articulation of digital literacy, remembering that his was actually published in 1997, and he would have been writing the paper of the book in 1996. Subsequently, things started to increase. So if we look at 2015, this one up here, we're up to 20,000 gigabytes. So that's 10 terabytes per second we're now talking about. So the blue is per second. Internet traffic is expected to at least triple in the next 5 years. So you're talking in the area of 70,000 terabytes of information traveling around the internet every second of every day. So it's a somewhat different proposition to what Glister would have been experiencing. This is an interesting little breakdown of the share of web traffic by the different devices that are commonly in use. So if you look here, this data is from 2017. So laptops and desktops in 2017 were generating almost half of the internet traffic, but that was reducing by about 20% per year. Mobile phones, on the other hand, was generating approximately 50% of the traffic, again nearly half, but it was increasing by about 30% year on year. Tablet devices, iPads and so on, 5%, and any other device was less than 1%. So you can see that mobile phones are taking over. This has significant implications for the way that we look at digital literacy. Just thought another little bit of history. This is Martin Cooper, who made the first mobile call using a handheld device in 1973. It was called the brick, and you can probably see why. And certainly our technologies are a lot more advanced these days. You no longer need to be a waitlister to make a call. We have a plethora of devices that we can use, smart mobile devices. It's estimated that there are more mobile devices in the world than the population, which is a scary thought. So these devices are incredibly powerful, and most people who use them don't really appreciate how powerful. In general, you have more computing power in your pocket than the IBM mainframe of the last century, the picture that I showed you earlier. How are these devices used? Well, obviously social media. Our younger generation generates a lot of internet traffic through Facebook and similar social media sites. Taking pictures. I'm sure we've all stood taking pictures of beautiful views with our phones, and they take much better phones than some cheaper cameras these days. taking selfies and so on. So a lot of traffic is generated that way. We do our shopping online, sharing personal data with apparent impunity. We can control our homes and systems using our mobile devices. I was fascinated to discover my daughter, who lives in the UK, managing the temperatures in her house from the supermarket. We had gone shopping, and she was trying to heat the home up so that it was warmer by the time we got back home. Beautiful. Love that idea. Oops, beg your pardon. The advent of augmented and virtual reality means we can experience the world in the comfort of our own homes. And it has significant implications for the way we teach, because now we can access inaccessible parts of the world, again, from the comfort of our own home. The ultimate is to have wearable devices, so to have your computer on your wrist. This is actually a simulation, but we do have Fitbits and we have Apple Watches and so on. So what are the implications? As far as teaching and learning is concerned, students come to us expecting to use the digital technologies that they know and are familiar with. And we kind of anticipate that students are going to be digitally literate because they use all of these devices and they are comfortable with social media and so on. Not only that, but students think they are digitally literate because they do use all of these devices quite comfortably. But when it comes down to it, not really sure about this. So what does digital literacy entail in the 21st century? It's easy to see the significant changes that have occurred to digital technologies in a very short time. Students are significant consumers of digital technology. Does that mean they can use what we use or what we want them to use? We assume that our students are digitally literate, and most think they are. But what should digital literacy entail in the 21st century? Here you see a few models of digital literacy. And what I want you to think about while we're going through these next few slides is that the digitally supported activities I've described here in the previous few slides have significant implications for the user beyond an understanding of information literacy and being able to communicate using a variety of means. Security, privacy, well-being, digital responsibilities and consequences are all aspects of using digital devices these days that we have to consider. We need to be aware of all of these aspects of using digital technologies. Mobile technologies, smart devices are ubiquitous. We need to ensure our students and us understand the often hidden implications of using them. These three models that I'm showing you here have been around for quite a long while, and they have been developed in the context of the UK education system. So JISC, the Joint Information Systems Committee, have done a lot of work commencing around 2005, so quite some time ago, in supporting further and higher education to understand and incorporate digital literacy in the programs. So this is actually about 10 years ahead of where we're at in Australia. Europe generally is further ahead than us in their understanding and integration of digital literacy learning within their education systems. The JISC understanding of digital literacy incorporates a range of elements, including ICT proficiency, digital creation and problem solving and innovation, as you can see here, communication and collaboration and participation. They've included learning and development because this is in the context of education environments. There's information, data and media literacy, so it's just one element. So what Glister had as a definition of digital literacy now is considered one element of digital literacy. And we now have this whole concept of digital identity and well-being. Belshaw developed 8 elements of digital literacy. They're called the 8 C's, which is a slightly different way of looking at digital literacy, but still encompasses the same sort of elements as JISC has included. But I think the really interesting part of the work that has been done in the UK is that this underlying philosophy of these models is that digital literacy looks beyond functional IT skills, which are captured in the concept of ICT proficiency, to describe a richer set of digital behaviours, practices and identities, a set of academic and professional situated practice supported by diverse and changing technologies. I do apologise, I'm not able to keep up with chat at the moment, but I see Matthew's question, does the idea of thinking like a computer fit into it? Algorithmic thinking is a really important part of problem solving, and should be independent of the technology, I think. So it should be a skill that we are teaching that enables us to solve problems, but also utilize computers to help us solve problems. I'm happy to argue that one at another point. I'd just like to come to the Beetham and Sharp pyramid now. This has been used in conjunction with the JISC definition. It's a pyramid, as the name suggests, has 4 elements. I have, I can, I do, I am, and I hope, if I'm right, the next slide captures that. So at the bottom of the pyramid is I have, and that's functional access. So I have access to these technologies. I can is skills development, and that means that I can use those tools that I have functional access to. I do situated practices, so that I do actually use these tools in particular circumstances, and I recognise when to use them. But I am is the highest level, and that's identity development. So it is a state of being, if you like. You may, the JISC model is a petal model, and it kind of looks like that ICT proficiency is in the middle of the world. It's actually not, it's at the bottom. So you can think of it as the foundation on which all of these other elements build. If you don't have ICT proficiency, you can't use the technology, therefore all of these other elements are meaningless. So that's the implication there. Sorry, I think I missed a page. No, I haven't. Another model that is very useful but very complex is the all-aboard map. Now, this is a way of describing each of the elements that JISC have highlighted. So perhaps if I can pick up here tools and technology, this is the grey line. And if you go down this grey line, you'll see that this is talking about using different tools. Find and use, the purple line, is talking about information. And you can follow each of the different coloured lines under a different theme. Some of the stations on the lines are shared. So, for example, presentation tools belong to both Teach and Learn and tools and technologies. So you can see the interaction of all of these skills. They are not independent. If you go to the website, the All Aboard website, this particular map is interactive. So they have a lot of tools and resources underlying each of the stations to help with understanding what each of those stations relate to. So if we look at this quite complex one, Beetham and Sharp and the JISC model, and take Belshaw's 3 C's, then I would like to propose an understanding of digital literacy, which actually tells us nothing about the technology, but gives us a sense of the breadth and depth that digital literacy now entails. And my understanding of digital literacy is if you are digitally literate, you are able to identify and use technology competently, confidently, and creatively. So that's picking up on some of the elements from Gilster, to effectively meet the demands and challenges of living, learning, and working in a digital society. So what I'm saying here is that technology is ubiquitous. We need to be able to use it appropriately. Underlying this descriptor is a hierarchy of literacies which need to be interpreted within the context of specific disciplines or situations. For example, in computer science there would be greater emphasis on the interpretation of ICT proficiency, whereas a journalist needs to have really good understanding of communication, collaboration, participation, as well as information, data, and media. Marketers need to understand how social media works. What skills my mother needs to talk to her grandchildren across the world will be different from the skills her grandchildren need to negotiate the digitally disrupted world of work that they will encounter in their futures. So what are the implications for learning and teaching? Well, I undertook a survey at the end of last year, asking academics across Australia to talk about their expectations of students' capabilities and their observations of the skill set that those students had. Now, in this particular graph, yellow is what I expect my students to be able to do. The green is what they indicated students could do, and red is the rest. The really worrying aspect of this is that there are very few elements of digital use that students actually meet teachers' expectations. The only ones that do are send me an email, attach a document to an email, and word process a document. All the others, those students who can, are in the minority. And this is from a group of academics who consider their students to be digitally literate. So obviously there's a huge mismatch between what they are expecting as a digital literate student and what's being delivered. What's particularly concerning above and beyond this is that element of disconnect continues through to senior students. Now, the definition of junior students and senior students here. Junior students is where the academics were talking about students who were undertaking units where it was likely they would be new to the institution, whereas senior students were ones that would have been returning, so it wasn't their first year of study. So here, there are still a number of things where there is a huge mismatch between the academics' expectations and what they observe of the students' ability to deliver. Not surprisingly, one of the differences is submitting an assignment online between the junior and the senior students. But there is still a frightening mismatch down this end of the graph, which relates to understanding file types, locating resources, using search engines, privacy, copyright, being able to use a discussion board, managing online identity. I threw proficiency at keyboarding skills in because I think we're going to end up with an awful lot of students with RSI, but that was my little preference. And interestingly, using social media to support their learning. Now, these students use social media all the time, and yet they are unable to transfer their socially learned skills to a learning environment. So obviously, there is a lot that we have to do to support them. So what are the implications for learning and teaching? Well, it would be useful for the students if they knew exactly what the institution was expecting of them as far as digital literacy skills are concerned. But there are actually very few universities that have any such sort of statement. It would be good if there was centralised support for students to meet those expectations, and I'm sure that many universities have a lot of support in place. But how well is it being utilised, and is it being utilised as standalone resources, or is it being contextualised within their learning in their discipline? It would be helpful if we knew what employers expected, but employers are just as much in the dark, it seems, around digital literacy as everybody else. We need to be able to scaffold within the curriculum to move students from a social digital literacy capability to something that is approaching digital fluency that's going to stand them in good stead when they hit the workforce. And we need to change students from being consumers of digital content to producers of digital content. We need to develop a framework that's going to inform curriculum development through the AQF levels, just like any other curriculum development. And we need to ensure that our academics are digitally literate teachers. There were some interesting comments that came out of the survey. There was a very strong assumption by academics that because our students are digital natives, they are digitally literate. And this is despite the fact that the notion of digital native has been a myth for some years, known to be a myth for some years. Students consider that the use of mainstream software and social media equates to being digitally literate, but they are unable to translate those skills, transfer those skills to different contexts. And the last paragraph here is a really interesting comment from one of the respondents around digital literacy skills, and I'll give you a moment to read that.
Joe, can I just ask, there was a couple of questions around were the surveys coming from responses of academics, or were they responses from students?
Academics. So I asked academics what they expected, and I asked academics what they observed in their classroom. One thing I do want to do is survey students, but it's much easier to survey academics than students in the present ethical climate. But I will get to that, so we will have some comparisons in the future. Okay. So these webinars are particularly interested in assessment, so I'd like to talk about the implications of this mismatch in digital literacy skills as far as assessment is concerned. I think one of the important things that I have learnt from this process is that digital literacy learning needs to be contextualized in other learning. It's not something that you learn as a standalone thing. It's not like being able to do arithmetic or being able to read and write. It's got to be contextualized within the discipline. So the learning has to be appropriate to that and has to be relevant to that. With the work that I was doing with the optometry department, it's become blatantly obvious that we actually don't need to add anything to curricula. One of the things that academics were very concerned about was the fact that if they were expected to teach digital literacy, they would have to lose elements from their discipline curriculum because of the constraints of time. But one of the things that became also blatantly obvious is that digital literacy needs to be explicitly assessed. Conditions apply, but we'll worry about that later. So let me talk about what we did in optometry. So within optometry, it's a very constrained course here at Deakin. There are no electives in the program, which is all compulsory. Consists of 3 years of undergrad, 1 year of postgrad, which is squished into 3 years because we have a trimester system. What the academics did was look at all of the unit guides and looked for where there was explicit learning outcomes that had some relation to digital literacy. It may not have been explicit, it might have been implicit. Deakin does have a digital literacy graduate learning outcome, so but it is articulated in terms of information literacy mainly, and so there was quite a lot of hits as far as information literacy was concerned. And they used Beetham and Sharp's pyramid to categorize the learning outcomes in terms of the I have, I can, I do, I am. So the I have is I have access to the tools. So here are some learning outcomes that were articulated in a number of units relating to digital literacy. So the first one, I have access to and can use bibliographic referencing tools such as EndNote. Now the annotation on the right over here is which year levels that was relevant to, so units from which year level. The E is explicit, the I is implicit, the T is teaching, the A is assessment. Okay, so I have access to EndNote was explicitly taught and explicitly assessed. So in an early unit, students were shown how to use EndNote, and I think that was done by the library staff, and they had some explicit assessment around using EndNote. So they had to demonstrate that they could use it. Similarly, here's another one. This one's slightly different. I'm aware of library purchased and freely available information resources. This was implicitly taught. So there wasn't actually an explicit articulation of these particular information resources, but there were activities that implied that they had to go to the library and find them. Which is fine, we can't teach students everything. This one down here, I can use clinical diagnostic tools, was really interesting because they discovered that it was being implicitly taught, but also implicitly assessed. So what was happening with this? These diagnostic tools in optometry are particularly technology enabled. And so students were having to use the technology that these tools encompassed. They weren't actually taught how to use the tools, and they had to use the tools in assessment to be able to complete an assessment item, so hence the implicit assessment. Now that they considered to be of huge concern, because they weren't teaching how to use the tool, but they were expecting students to be able to use the tool for quite a substantial assessment item, then there was a big mismatch here. So this was carried through to I can, so there's the skills, and I apologise for the smaller print here, but you'll see that the skills align to the tools that they had access to. So for example, I can source, consult and synthesize literature. So that's relating to being able to access the library. I can prepare scientific and educational posters. There was a tool around being able to prepare videos and so on. And again, explicitly taught, explicitly assessed, implicitly taught, explicitly assessed. Yeah, okay. Here we come to the implicitly taught and implicitly assessed. And here I can make use of technology in order to attend case conference sessions. So these conference sessions were facilitated online. Excuse me. And students were expected to be able to use the conference system in order to participate in these cases, and participation in the cases was assessed. Similarly with practices, so we're going up the year levels now. I can critically appraise the quality of scientific information and so on. And we come back down to here. So this one actually belongs to this one here. So I can argue for perspectives using appropriate claims backed by evidence. We've got to be able to find the evidence online, assess its validity and relevance and soundness, And yet, doing that is not implicitly taught, but it is being implicitly assessed. I conduct myself professionally, so now we're coming up to higher levels in the optometry course, and right at the end, I manage my online persona and personal information, so the attributes, so I effectively develop evidence-based communications, etc. So what were the implications? The optometry staff realised that optometry is an evidence-based discipline, so it was really important that students could collect and curate information to create knowledge. And so their digital literacy skills were very focused on that. But what they hadn't taken into account were things like students, optometrists in the Australian context are generally small business owners. They have to understand business practice. They have to understand about privacy of client information. They have to be able to meet government restrictions and requirements as far as running a business is concerned. And those sort of things were not captured in their understanding of digital literacies. So they went through this 4-stage process to improve the digital literacy component of their assessments. They didn't end up adding much as far as teaching are concerned, but they drew on a lot of outside resources to provide students with the tools and the skills which they could then draw on to teach and assess the capabilities and attributes. And it was a 4-stage process. So they started off by looking at what the capabilities of the professional was. They deconstructed the skill set, so they had a set of learning outcomes. They looked at the assessment against those skills, identified the gaps, and then addressed the gaps. So that's a little 4-stage process that they did to address the gaps in the digital literacy learning. And that hasn't been evaluated yet. They've only just implemented it, but they are already seeing, I've heard anecdotally, they're already seeing some significant improvements in the digital literacy skills of their students. So that's me for today. I hope you found that interesting, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Jo. Folks, if you have questions, you may type them into the text chat box, or you may put up your virtual hand using the hands up symbol, bing bing, and that will let us know you'd like to use the microphone. Okay, so I'm seeing there is some comments coming through in the text chat. You can see some people. Hopefully we get some questions.
I think you're probably exhausted.
Okay.
Yes, they were. The optometry team were quite surprised by the mapping results. I don't think they were surprised by the focus on information literacy, because that's what they had designed that program around because of the Deakin graduate learning outcome. But they were very surprised at the implicit teaching and implicit assessment. It hadn't occurred to them that that might be happening. And I think they had an understanding that some of the gaps in the digital literacy coverage from the more modern understanding of digital literacy were there, but they didn't have the means of addressing it. Given the rapid change in device use, I'm hoping that the understanding that I have articulated will actually have some longevity, because it's not talking in terms of specific use or specific use or specific technologies, but it's rather in the context of being able to use in a way that is going to allow you to grow as the technologies change. I saw another question back here. There's my definition of digital literacy for 2018. You're typing too fast. I'm losing the questions. There was one back here. It'd be good to know how we can build evidence around this approach, method, and support back, and it's talking this way. Yes, I think the optometry was a pilot here at Deakin. We are currently preparing a paper for submission, or we have submitted to Scaffold, and I would be very happy to hear from academics who would like to adopt this approach in their courses to see how it can be used in a wider range of disciplines. Should digital literacy be taught? It should be taught in context. And I think the key here is that students are taught that the skills that they learn playing an educational game to learn arithmetic in kindergarten, the skills that they've learned there are transferable to other contexts, other situations, and other year levels.
There's a question from Kirsty a bit further up. We've also found the term digital literacy is meaningless to students. Do you use any other terminology when talking to students?
Sorry, can you say that again?
It's about using the terminology. So if you're talking to students and you use the words digital literacy,
yes.
Kirsty sort of found, she's from the University of Wollongong Library, it appears, found this term is somewhat meaningless to them. I think I could probably half answer it in that it's got to be contextualized.
It has to be contextualized. Quite frankly, it doesn't matter what term you use, as long as we have some consistent understanding. And I think I mean, some people talk about digital literacies as in the plural. Some people, depending on your background, there are sort of priorities that are captured within that concept that are more important than others. I talk to people who are in education and in social sciences, and we end up having a very robust discussion around the terminology because, of course, literacy has specific meaning in education. So as far as whatever you call it is concerned, it needs to be articulated so that you've got this concept that you are using technology, not just to use technology, but to achieve some goal in your life, in your learning, and in your working. And it has to be, you have to be adaptable and flexible in the way that you approach digital literacy. So I hope that answers in part that question. Yeah, the problem isn't in talking to academics, it isn't talking to a student. Yeah, that's why it's really important that it's contextualized. They have to understand that they need to know this stuff because they're an optometrist in this particular case. So they need to understand the technology behind these optometry tools in order to be able to use the optometry tools effectively.
And I would add, to survive as a small business person who's going to be running an optometry business inevitably, most of the time.
Yeah,
so accounting tools and email and communication, etc.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, what is your perspective on the role of things like, what do they call it, computational thinking or systems thinking and things like that, which is also closely related to the technology info systems kind of area?
Yep. I think because we are moving to such a technology-heavy workplace, there has to be greater understanding of how to work with the technology. And I think that the digital disruption in the workplace means that you have to know more about, sort of I'm trying to think of an example, but what comes to mind is, for example, being able to deal with big data, being able to turn it into something that is understandable for in your context, being able to do some visualizations. Now, those sort of things you could say are the domain of computer scientists or data analysts or statisticians, but it's becoming more and more the domain of everybody in the workplace. So you are presented with a whole heap of information, you've got to make sense of it. And so understanding ways and means of doing that is becoming more important. Obviously, the level at which you can do these things is going to depend very much on what your role is, what your context is. But the computational thinking, algorithmic thinking, it's all to do with problem solving. And problem solving in the context that you have to use technology to be able to facilitate that.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. So it's the technology is the tool, and the computational thinking is the way of understanding the affordances and the capabilities and the problem match. That's sort of how you put it all together to get something useful out the other end.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Is there any last questions from folks? We've still got another 5 minutes left if you would like to pose any more, but if not, if you could please fill in our feedback survey whilst we're here, that would be good. But Joe, I think hopefully I'll catch you at Ascolite. I plan to go this year, so I'll see if I can get along to your session.
Well,
interesting to hear your findings.
I hope it's accepted. I don't know. I have no guarantee of that, even though it is hosted by Deakin, but I'm hopeful. But I will be at Ascolite, so I'll be happy to get together with any of you if you're there, and we can have a chat.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we've only got a couple of people left. Is there any last questions before I shut off the recording? Yep, thank you, Peter. Okay, it looks like everybody's saying their goodbyes. So I will formally close. So thank you, Joe. It's an interesting discussion. I think very timely. The idea of using technology to solve problems is, whilst it's been around a long time, it's sort of really it's hitting the on time at the moment. So, I mean, if you look at those statistics that you showed earlier with the percentages of people involved with using technology, it's not so much the people who the makers, the creators, and whilst they're important, they're not the majority. So the ability for the average Joe in society to be able to live and survive in this world today means they need to be digitally literate in all sorts of ways. So I think it's extremely important. I
think the really important part there is that we have a really broad understanding of what digital literacy is, and we don't get precious about it.
Yes, I would agree. What my personal thoughts on digital literacy is there's a whole spectrum of literacies there. Everything, yes, there are computer programming and algorithmic thinking kind of literacies, but there's also how do you deploy it to solve a business problem? How do you, develop a digital presence, if you will, in the world, awareness of critical analysis of information that's coming through digital systems, etc. So I think it's a very rich area of research, and something that I think there are certainly disciplines out there that need to pay a lot more attention to this, because we are supposedly producing graduates for the modern world, the 21st century, and this is the working world. So they have to come out the other end of our institutions with literacies like these. So thank you for doing this very important work.
I'm really enjoying it, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. I always love talking about digital literacy, and each time I do a presentation, I find out something new. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Joe. I'm going to stop the recording, and hopefully we'll see you soon at Ascolite. Arrivederci, everybody.
Thank you all very much indeed.
All right, bye all.